Okay, good morning, everyone. There are still a few more people coming in at the minute, but if we do the introduction first, hopefully they'll all get online before Dan starts his main presentation. Dan, if I can ask you to turn your camera on so everyone can see you there. They don't all just want to look at me. So while people are still, there he is, while people are still logging in, to everyone that's joined us so far and those still coming in, thank you very much for joining us for our third in the series of ICL and Advanced Invasives webinars on invasive species. Many of you have joined before in the previous sessions. Some of you are new, so we'll go through a couple of main points. Just to confirm that this webinar is again BASIS accredited. There will be an email going out at the end of this webinar. It will have various follow-up links to previous webinars, but also a way for you to submit your registration, your BASIS registration, and then we'll catalog it and you'll get points assigned to you for sitting through us talking at you. Today's topic is managing woody invasive plants, making the right choices, particularly focusing on Buddleja and Rhododendron. And again, is being presented by the ever faithful Dr. Dan Jones. For those of you that are new to this, haven't sat through me doing this the two previous times before, Dr. Dan is Director of Advanced Invasives, a consultancy founded in 2016 to bring evidence-led thinking to commercial management of invasive plants. Among many things, Dan specialises in the detection, mapping and sustainable management of invasive plants, and also holds the honorary title of Honorary Researcher in the Department of Biosciences at Swansea University. So before I hand over and let Dan do all the heavy lifting in this, because I just get to do the introduction and Q&A at the end, for those of you that are new to this, and I can see some of you are, we will have a Q&A session at the end of this presentation. You can ask questions through the whole presentation. They'll be catalogued at the end. You can also resize the screen. So if I show you how that's done, then once we go through that, I'll hand over to Dan. So on your screen, you'll see the picture of Dan and myself and the presentation that I've currently got on slide below there. Between that and our images are three little lines and a grey bar. That allows you to resize your imagery. So you can shrink us, enlarge us, do what you want, but you can focus on the presentation. All you've got to do is click on those little three bars, hold your finger down on your mouse button and drag up or down appropriately, and you can resize it. You can also ask questions, like I said, at any point. I'll collate the questions because quite often lots of people will ask questions and some of them are variations on theme or duplicates. So I'll collate them, put them all together, and we'll ask Dan at the end, time permitting. Sometimes we run out of time with these questions. Some of them take a bit more for in-depth, complicated answer that Dan provides. Any we don't get to cover, Dan and I will do at another time offline, and we'll video it. So we'll cover everyone's questions and we'll release that video as well. You can ask the questions by clicking on the questions tab at the right hand of your screen. The questions will open up. You type your question in there. It will appear for me. I'll acknowledge the first couple so you know it's working, and then as Dan's presenting, I will start collating the questions. At the very end, we'll have a Q&A session. We'll get through as many as we possibly can in that time. And again, if we don't get to them all, apologize now, but we will do them offline. We'll video it and we'll release that video as well for everyone to be able to see. So that should cover the housekeeping. You'll be able to move the screen size. You can ask questions all the way throughout. Please do ask questions. The more questions that are asked, the more relevant this presentation is, and it really gets people thinking and gives them lots and lots of information. So for me, that's it. Now I can see pretty much everyone is now in. So without any further delay, I will now hand over presentation to Dan, and I'll let him do the presentation on managing invasive weeds, Buddleja and Rhododendron, and I will see you at the other end. Thank you very much. Dan, all yours.
Thanks very much, Barry. So for those of you that haven't joined us previously, the previous two webinars were taking a look at rhizome forming plants, so Japanese knotweed, annuals like Himalayan balsam, perennial biennials like giant hogweed. And in short, we were looking at the best ways of managing these different species, the unique challenges that they pose in terms of their life cycle, life strategy, and really how best to manage them when we're out in the field. So today, as the final instalment of the trilogy, as ICL put it, we're taking a look at woody invasive plants and how best we can manage these in the environment by using the right herbicides at the right time and sustaining treatments long enough that we get really good control and management and potentially local eradication. Again, for those of you that haven't joined us before, Advanced Invasives is a consultancy that solves invasive plant problems. And today, again, we're looking at some of our research and testing work, strategy, continuing professional development, and also the public guidance element of things. In terms of what Advanced Invasives is, it's the consulting offer of our business, and the business as a whole consists of consulting and also the R&D offer, AI Lab, and this is all based on my PhD field trial studies that I undertook at Swansea University with complete weed control. And quite uniquely and differently from many other consultancies, we're constantly updating the knowledge and information and sharing that through our academic research, so the knotweed paper in 2018. And this is the way that we share, disseminate our information to the wider public and amenity sector. So in terms of what we'll be looking at today is the functional approach to managing invasive plants. As I mentioned, we've looked at rhizome forming annual species with large seed banks. Today we're going to be taking a look at how best to manage woody invasive plants to do it at minimal cost and deliver more for our clients. So we'll start with rhododendron. Now, I've mentioned rhododendron here because this is the key invasive plant that we're going to be talking about. It's the one that invades upland areas, has these negative impacts on nature and conservation. But there's actually a huge number of rhododendron species in the UK because of their horticultural importance. And there's also yellow azalea, the closely related yellow azalea, which is, again, it's a horticultural introduction that is increasingly causing problems in the UK. So we'll focus on rhododendron for this presentation because it's by far the most impacted of these species. And just to quickly kind of introduce it as a species, this particular plant originates from the Iberian Peninsula, so Spain and Portugal. And it was an horticultural introduction, but also cover for game birds. So this is one of the reasons that you find it in upland areas of the UK, close to Victorian estates. And importantly, it's still available from nurseries, not Rhododendron ponticum, but the species, the taxa as a whole, is still available from nurseries. In terms of how it grows, it's a densely growing, quite tall shrub. So it's growing up to around 8 to 10 meters tall. And the highly branched, dense growth was what made it suitable as a game cover. In terms of the leaves, they're quite large, oblong, dark green, and they're evergreen as well. So again, its importance as game cover. And these leaves are quite thick, waxy, and very unpalatable to vertebrates and invertebrates because they contain a range of different compounds that make them unsuitable for eating, so phenols and diterpenes. In terms of flowers, this was the reason that it was introduced as a horticultural species. So you've got quite vivid purple flowers held in big groups or racemes. And flowering is from May to June and insect pollinated as well. So it's quite well suited to growth and persistence in upland areas of the UK. Now, importantly, and in contrast with knotweed, giant hogweed, it's shallow rooting. So it's got quite limited root growth below ground. To give you a bit of an idea of what rhododendron looks like, you can see at left, rhododendron growing in semi-wild areas or semi-managed areas of Beta sequoia, so that's up in Snowdonia National Park. There's an image there of the quite striking purple flowers. The woody seed capsules can be seen at the top right, and then you can see at the bottom right where rhododendron is still growing widely, again in Beta sequoia, and it's these source populations are contributing towards the ongoing invasion at the local scale of rhododendron into the environment. So in terms of the spread and dispersal of rhododendron, there are escapes, ongoing escapes, particularly in upland areas of the UK, but the overall distribution of rhododendron is not expanding in the same way that other invasive plants are. In short, it's occupied most of the areas where it's going to be invasive. So those are particularly upland areas of the UK, areas of conservation. In terms of the reproductive strategies, vegetative reproduction is important in rhododendron, and this is through layering. So as growth accumulates, it begins to root down and form extensive growth at ground level. And this makes it quite difficult to control using physical methods. This is something that isn't really reported, is that layering allows it to recover from being stockpiled following pulling, for example. In terms of sexual reproduction, there's a huge amount of seed production per plant, and you're looking at around millions of seeds produced per plant. In terms of the flower, each flower produces a woody capsule that we saw in the previous slide, and that contains around 3,000 seeds. In terms of the dispersal, there's a huge amount of spread by the wind and also waters, and these can be transported considerable distances away from that parent plant. And when you think about where this plant's growing, upland areas of the UK, that's going to be a significant dispersal risk. In terms of the seed viability, thinking back to the previous presentations, this is a key area that we've got to focus on in terms of ongoing management strategies. How long are they viable in the ground? Controlling the large plants is important, but also keeping on top of that seed bank is also critical. And to the best of our knowledge, we're looking at 3 to 4 years with rhododendron. So just to give you an idea of the distribution of these plants in the UK, rhododendron is widespread and throughout the UK, upland areas of the UK, and it's also very widespread in Ireland. Yellow azalea, which is becoming increasingly problematic throughout the UK, is increasing its distribution. You can see this image at the right there. In terms of the ecological impacts, rhododendron has a range of impacts, but these do tend to be focused in areas of nature conservation, upland areas, and areas of forestry as well. And it's this dense thickets, thick layering, shade out native flora. This halts regeneration of trees, and it destroys the ground vegetation on moors. So it's got a range of different impacts. It's also host to Phytophthora that attack oak and beech. So it's also at risk in terms of biosecurity. There's disruption of terrestrial and freshwater food webs and pollination services. These are a result of the shading and also the disproportionate pollination effect early in the season from rhododendron. And it's also poisonous to livestock. So ingestion of the foliage causes stomach issues for grazing animals. There's also honey intoxication of humans. So this is where bees have accumulated the toxins from the flowers, concentrated it in the honey, and then humans ingest that. This is quite rare, and to the best of my knowledge, it's mainly reported in places like Turkey, where there's a lot of consumption of the honey produced by rhododendron flowers. So in terms of the socio-economic impacts, it's mainly in forestry, because rhododendron hinders, prevents planting and restocking. In terms of the control costs, we're looking at around £8.6 million per year in the UK, but there's an associated cost with rhododendron in terms of the pathogens that it carries, and plant pathogens in general cost around £500 million per annum in the UK. So there's likely to be an underestimate in terms of the total cost associated with rhododendron in the UK. Just to give you an idea of where this species grows and the ease of transport of these seeds through the environment, again, we've got beta-sequoid in both of these images, and you can see how management in certain areas, you've got to keep on top of those sort of pockets of rhododendron and prevent that seeding into the environment. And you can see this at right, where seeds have been washed downstream and forming new plants short distance away from those mature trees. So in terms of rhododendron management, there's a lot of focus on physical methods. There's an avoidance of using herbicides for a range of different reasons. But I mean, ultimately, and we addressed this in the previous presentations, physical methods are very, very laborious. So looking at these in turn, you've got tracked swing shovel, uprooting using winch, JCB, manual labour. These are all going to be critically dependent on access. And if you think about the areas that you work in, it's going to be steep slopes, often wet. So, you know, moving machinery in those areas is going to be very difficult. And then you've got additional processes that need to be undertaken. So you've got to remove the material, chip it and burn it. And those processes are really unsuitable for sensitive conservation areas, and it's really questionable whether they're sustainable as well, both from an efficacy perspective and also an environmental perspective. How much carbon dioxide are we using in those processes? You can cut rhododendron by hand. There's also a process called lever and mulch, but again, we're talking about labor-intensive processes. There's vigorous resprouting following cutting, and without chipping that material, there's a possibility of layering on ground level, particularly because you're talking about very wet areas. So the moisture content of the area is going to allow those cut plants to persist. In terms of the biological control, there are fungal biocontrols available for rhododendron, but at present, these don't seem to be effective in stopping resprouting of the plant, so they're basically ineffective. As I mentioned, foliage is toxic, preventing grazing, and in terms of there have been suggestions around other biocontrol agents, but ultimately you've got to be really careful because you've got so many introduced species cultivated in the UK. If there is an effective biocontrol for rhododendron and it host switch to those, that's going to cause problems in itself. There's a distinct lack of I can't think of the best word for it, but people don't want their prized rhododendrons to get killed by a biocontrol agent. In terms of the chemical control available for rhododendron, there's a range of different methods suggested in the UK, New Zealand and North America. So we're looking at glyphosate, 2,4-D, triclopyr and metsulfuron. In terms of getting the herbicide into the plant, plant protection adhesion and absorption is limited by waxy leaves. So you really do need to consider things like adjuvants in order to improve foliar efficacy of herbicides. So in terms of the application methods that are proposed in the literature, foliar spray, also wounding, so making cuts into the plant and then applying the herbicide using a knapsack spray. And there's also weed wiper recommended in conservation areas. We don't really cover it in this presentation, but there's a range of stump treatments also recommended for management of rhododendrons. So you can see those at the bottom there: drill and inject, stump painting, stump spot spraying as well, and also eco-plug. So those are effective but time consuming. In terms of integrated weed management systems, although none are listed, it really would be advantageous to get some of these squared away in order that we can manage rhododendron at wider scales. Thinking back to how long that seed bank's viable, all control methods must be applied for at least 3 years to achieve depletion of the seed bank and get good control and management and potentially eradication. And it's interesting, and this is something that we're investigating with some of our commercial partners in this year and next year, is it's a bit unclear whether the chemical control treatments using any of the herbicide active ingredients kill the fully mature rhododendron plants. Now, this is something that isn't really very well addressed in the literature to date. So just to kind of give you an idea of the problems that rhododendron causes, we'll take a quick look at a case study that I found in Cardiff. So the first time that I was made aware of this particular study, or mismanagement, was when I went for a walk in Roath Park in Cardiff, which is managed by Cardiff County Council. And there was a notice to visitors asking people to be very careful because Phytophthora, the pathogen, had been brought into the park. Now, I was a bit curious as to how the pathogen had ended up in Roath Park, and following some discussions and taking a look around, it turned out that rhododendron had been cut in another park with a lot of rhododendron because Phytophthora had been found there. And the rhododendron had been cut back, a lot of it had been burned, but then about midway through the project, they'd run out of funds, and consequently, the remaining 50% of the rhododendron couldn't be burnt in situ, so it was brought in its entirety to the compost heap, the large industrial scale compost heap in Road Park. Now, this caused problems because the rhododendron containing the Phytophthora, then the Phytophthora spread from the rhododendron into the parkland. DEFRA scientists came in, determined that Phytophthora was found throughout the parkland, and rhododendron was then cleared from a number of islands and surrounding habitats. Now, the problem with this is, firstly, that the rhododendron was brought into the park, causing a problem in the first place, but secondly, that the rhododendron wasn't killed, because the rhododendron roots are an ongoing, living rhododendron roots are an ongoing reservoir for Phytophthora, so it's going to continue to spread in the environment. There's an additional issue with this. The cherry laurel is also a reservoir for Phytophthora, and none of the cherry laurel was managed. So there's a number of different issues with this, but I think it'd be, if we could control, manage, kill the rhododendron, prevent it being an ongoing, continuing source of Phytophthora, that would be an obvious benefit for all involved in this project. Moving on to butterfly bush. Now, butterfly bush, again, is one of a number of invasive species, Buddleja species. So we've also got, with respect to the butterfly bush family, we've also got orange ball tree, which is an introduction from South America, and Weyer's butterfly bush. Now, this was a hybrid formed in the introduced range. I think, interestingly and crucially, from the perspective of all three of these webinars, is that butterfly bush is not listed under the Wildlife and Countryside Act. And this seems to be because it's apparently a nectar source for native pollinators, but this remains a bit of a topic of argument amongst scientists. So taking a look at the biology and ecology of butterfly bush, so Buddleja in particular, it originates from Central and Western Asia. It's quite mountainous terrain, limestone cliffs, and it was a horticultural introduction to Britain in 1896. Because of its native, well, it's pre-adapted, so the growth strategies that it has in its native environment make it very suited to growing in limestone areas. So it was originally also introduced as a quarry screen, so grown to kind of screen the quarry workings away from prying eyes. In terms of the escape of Buddleja, it's spread rapidly throughout the UK. Its distribution's increased by 83% since 1984, so that really is very rapid spread. And in part, that's because of the suitable habitats that it finds in the UK. So railway embankments, lime mortar in walls, these are all really suitable habitats for Buddleja to grow, develop and seed further. In terms of its growth, again, we're talking about quite a large perennial shrub, up to 5 meters tall in this case, and again, very dense branching growth. In terms of the leaves, they're a little bit, they can be quite large, but I think the kind of key thing between Buddleja and also rhododendron is the leaf structure. Whereas rhododendron's got these thick, waxy cuticle on the leaves, Buddleja's got quite a downy, pubescent growth on the leaves. Now, both of these mean that foliar application of herbicides is a little bit challenging. In terms of the leaves, they're shed in autumn, replaced by smaller leaves with the hairs that I mentioned, and those are added to in the spring. So it's got quite an interesting cycle of leaf production through the year. Again, rhododendron flowers at maturity up to 8 years, whereas Buddleja we're looking at around 2 years before flowering. In terms of the flowering, insect pollinated between July and October, and in contrast with rhododendron, we're looking at a deep or shallow rooting plant, which depends on where it's growing, the location of growth, and a number of other ecological factors. Give you a bit of an idea of what Buddleja looks like in situ. You can see a full growth Buddleja at left. You can see the flowers being pollinated by butterflies at the top left. The woody seed capsules at the top right, and then the large panicle flower down in the bottom right there. So in terms of biology and ecology of Buddleja, vegetative reproduction is possible in this plant. You've got rootstock extension grafting of individuals, but stems, stumps and root fragments will produce new plants if washed downstream by floods, for example. In terms of the sexual reproduction, each flower produces one capsule with one seed, in contrast with rhododendron. And interestingly, the seeds set in the following spring. So if it's too wet, the seeds aren't released, so to improve the chances of germination success. In terms of seed dispersal, and one of the key reasons why it spreads so rapidly throughout the UK is the fact that it's dispersed by wind. And this can be a long way from the parent plant. So 95% of this seed is more than 10 meters away from the parent plant. And it's interesting that the larger the plant, the larger the seed production, and the larger the distance of seed rain, so distance of dispersal of the seeds from the parent plant. And just to kind of give you an idea of the output, a 2 meter tall Buddleja plant is you're looking at around 2 to 3 million seeds per plant. So this is a huge seed output. In terms of the viability of the seed in the seed bank, we're looking at around 4 years, and it's tolerant of a wide range of soil conditions, preferentially calcareous, alkaline soils, but it can grow in a lot of other settings. So following initial spread throughout the UK in areas that it's quite suited to, it is beginning to expand its range further now. To give you an idea of the kind of density of growth with Buddleja, you can see at left train tracks in Cardiff, where during the winter months, where you've got Buddleja absolutely lining the railway line. And you can see the seedlings growing up right in the lime mortar, not far from where the left image was taken. To highlight something about root growth in Buddleja, you can see how Buddlejas left unmanaged will eventually develop quite considerable root growth. And you can see here that, you know, getting in, managing that root growth is a key component of management. In terms of spread throughout the UK, as I mentioned, it's rapid, but you can see that Buddleja is now almost ubiquitous throughout the UK and increasingly so in Ireland. But orange ball tree and also Wales butterfly bush are increasingly spreading throughout the UK, and they're certainly species to keep an eye on going forwards. In terms of the impacts and control costs associated with Buddleja, there's a lot of research in the US and New Zealand into the impacts of Buddleja, and in short, the dense stands shade out native flora and alters natural succession, so the sequence of plants that you get in river settings in particular. There's also disruption of terrestrial food webs and pollination services, which kind of calls into question this idea of Buddleja being this beneficial plant that improves the nectar resource for native pollinators. In terms of the socioeconomic impacts, in sharp contrast with rhododendron, impacts are across the UK built environment, and arguably they're probably more significant than those that we see with Japanese knotweed. The sectors that are particularly impacted by Buddleja are transport corridors in particular, and to a lesser extent at the moment in the UK forestry, but that is observed in the US and New Zealand. In terms of the control costs, Buddleja is frequently overlooked, and I would argue that the £1 million estimate put together by Williams et al. is a huge underestimate of the true management costs of Buddleja at the UK scale. So to give you a bit of an idea again of what Buddleja looks like in situ and the effects of it on the built environment, you can see a large Buddleja plant at left there, and that's going to be producing tens of millions of seeds every year. And because of the height of this plant, and you can actually observe it in this street where they're carried down by the slipstream, you can see Buddleja plants of decrease in size that have been spread by the slipstreams of cars, and they're likely to have come from this plant. Certainly 10 years ago, it was the only Buddleja plant in the street. Moving on, you've got the effects of Buddleja in this case in the derelict building, but it kind of highlights that it doesn't take long for Buddleja to establish, spread, and then it's going to have a direct impact on the stability of structures. So it's one of those species that's often overlooked for both its ecological impacts and also its direct impacts on the built environment, and just the nuisance effect and the ongoing control and management costs. In terms of the management methods that are proposed for Buddleja, there's a range of different physical methods. So we've got here hand pulling, digging. You know, when you think about the size of the network rail estate, for example, and the density of growth in certain areas of that, these methods just aren't going to be practical, and you've got the issue of line-side access as well. So when you take a look at the cutting using any of the methods proposed, also uprooting using winches, these just aren't going to be suitable for managing Buddleja in these kind of areas, and they're going to be very highly access dependent. Again, the material produced is going to need to be chipped or burnt because there's going to be vigorous recovery following cutting. And ultimately, and this is often overlooked with the physical methods, is they're quite environmentally damaging and highly unsuitable for sensitive conservation areas. We might not be using herbicides, but there's a range of other negative impacts that these processes create in these kind of areas. In terms of the biocontrol, goat grazing has been proposed for Buddleja, but the long-term efficacy of that isn't reported. There are some insect biocontrols being proposed as well, and there's no available published data on those today. In terms of the chemical control strategies, again, we've got a range of different herbicides suggested as being effective for their management. And anecdotally, I can tell you that most of these herbicides are effective for butterfly bush management. There's foliar application methods, which realistically speaking, we should be aiming for because due to the labour costs, these are going to be far more sustainable, particularly when we're looking at strategic management of these plants. And again, we've got a range of stump treatment methods recommended, which involve things like wounding, drill and inject, stump painting, stump spot spraying, ecoplug mats. These are time consuming, and you know, a movement a little bit away from those in terms of sustainability is probably, particularly when we look at large linear estates, would enable us to do more with less. Crucially, with butterfly bush, repeat management, it's increasing the risk of glyphosate resistance. So where we can use different herbicides, different tools, reduce the risk of resistance development, that is going to be certainly something that we should aim to achieve in the coming years. So coming back to this issue of targeting life history events to get better control of these plants, looking at the functional approach in its whole. In terms of what we should be aiming for with control, management and eradication of invasive plants, we don't, particularly with Buddleja but also Rhododendron, we don't have a good evidence base to draw upon in order to manage these plants, and a lot of it is quite piecemeal, anecdotal development of ideas in order to manage these plants. And really we should be thinking about sustainable coordinated action in order to better manage these plants at the landscape scale. Certainly in terms of what we're talking about with these plants is control and management, and that is absolutely an achievable aim. In terms of eradication, the huge amount of seed production makes eradication of these plants difficult but not impossible at local scale if we use the right treatments at the right time and we sustain them for long enough that the seed bank is depleted. But I think this kind of issue of, you know, how much carbon dioxide, how much money, how much time has been spent, particularly on the management of rhododendron, and what have benefits been, you know, how far have we got with that, what have we achieved? And I think, you know, considering what your overall goal is, the overall life cycle of your treatment program is absolutely fundamental to delivering better results for our clients. In terms of management evaluations, decisions and controls, we need to have evidence to support our decision making, and we need to integrate methods where possible, but ensure to use the best tools for the job when it comes to invasives management. We need to ensure that we get the job done before the funds run out, and this is where selecting the right tools for the job really fundamental to achieving what we need to. So in terms of woody species, kind of a do's list is follow the law and client requirements. I'm going to be recommending the use of residual herbicides, and you've got to think about whether those are appropriate for the site. You know, do I need to notify a statutory body? And certainly when we're talking about conservation sites, LERAPs are likely to be applicable. In terms of the residuals, we've got to think about source protection zones as well. So make sure you read the label and follow the law. In terms of treatment timing, apply the herbicides during the growing season to ensure kill where possible, because this prevents flowering, seeding, and overall shortens the treatment life cycle and increases your chances of getting good control, management, and potentially eradication. Understanding how long the seed bank is absolutely viable is absolutely crucial to being able to do that. And preferentially use herbicides, particularly in the early stages of a control management process, because you're going to burn through your funds very quickly if you're focusing on physical methods as opposed to the use of herbicides. In terms of using the right herbicide, once treatment begins, use effective herbicides and physical methods sparingly, you know, to ensure that no further seed is set. Personally, and this is going to be the subject of research this year, personally I preferentially use synthetic auxin herbicides like Cinero, and ensure if you are using glyphosate-based herbicides, that might be down to it being an FSC site or a clean water site. If you are using glyphosate-based herbicides, use these with appropriate surfactants like Speedway. I'm not dismissing the use of some treatments for the effective management of these species, but I am pointing out they are more labour and time consuming. In terms of residual herbicides, these should be used away from water. Wherever possible, reduce your labour component, the cost of your labour component in these large-scale control programs. And just think about what you're doing before getting started in short. In terms of the best treatment methods, foliar spray is probably the best in most circumstances, though weed wiping might be useful in areas of conservation. Integration of physical with chemical control treatments might be appropriate in certain cases, but avoid using labour-intensive physical methods alone. You know, the program will never succeed in its objectives. In terms of the coverage and dose, apply during active growth at the label rate. Don't over-apply. Use the right herbicides at the right time. And I think crucially, and in quite sharp contrast with knotweed, we can achieve local eradication. And where you're undertaking this at scale, work from the top of the catchment, river catchment, down to the bottom to achieve better control and management at scale. So just to kind of give you a bit of a taster of where the research is going to be going this year and next, we'll take a quick look at some of the product selections that we're testing under field conditions. So in terms of mature woody invasives, herbicide and surfactant selection are critical for management of both rhododendron and buddleja. And it all comes down in these species, it's not about translocation per se, it's about getting the herbicide product into the leaf and then getting it throughout the plant. And the cuticle structure is key to this. It's the outer plant barrier. And there's two kind of structural issues with rhododendron and buddleja. With rhododendron, you've got a thick, waxy leaf cuticle, which means that diffusion or movement of herbicide across the leaf surface is quite difficult. And in buddleja, you've got quite a hairy leaf, which again traps herbicide and makes diffusion a little bit problematic in certain circumstances. And what we need to do is get that herbicide across the leaf, get it translocated throughout the plant. So we'll take a look at some of the product ideas that we've got in terms of undertaking that and hopefully affecting complete kill of mature buddleja and rhododendron. So in the first instance, I would recommend the use of synthetic auxins. They're targeted for control of woody weeds, woody invasive weeds like buddleja and rhododendron. So we've got two product ideas in terms of Cinero and Icade. And synthetic auxins work particularly well on woody invasive species because they've got a limited capacity to regrow from the damage caused by these products. However, when it comes to controlling these species, particularly in areas of conservation, people are going to ask you to use glyphosate. And in those cases, the best way of applying glyphosate, foliar application, if we're undertaking this at scale, means that we need to use surfactants to improve absorption, foliar absorption of those products over the leaf surfaces. Now, the way that adjuvants work is to basically turn the spherical ball of herbicide and spray solution that you can see at left into a much more flattened blob that you can see at right. And this allows you to, or permits the herbicide to diffuse across the leaf surface much more effectively. And that's what the addition of a surfactant to the glyphosate spray solution allows us to do. So if we are using foliar application of glyphosate, use a suitable adjuvant to get that onto the leaf surface and ensure that the glyphosate translocates, is absorbed across the whole of that leaf surface. In order to do this, use the right products, so things like Roundup Proactive, with an appropriate surfactant like Speedway. And really, certainly with rhododendron, not using these surfactants will lead to minimum reduction in control outcomes. In terms of the immature woody invasives, once we've got on top of those large mature plants, hopefully killed them, it's about mopping up any regrowth and also the germinating seeds that are going to be in situ, certainly for 4 to 5 years. With respect to long-term treatment, we've got to think about what we're doing. Plan your treatments over the longer term. Minimize your site time by avoiding time-consuming physical treatments from the outset, but also use residual herbicides where possible to minimize your labor costs and to get on top of the germinating seed bank before it becomes an issue and you have to use either more herbicide to control larger plants or physical methods to pull those larger plants out. In terms of achieving complete control, potentially of local eradication, multiple herbicide applications are going to be likely throughout the growing season for the control of rhododendron and Buddleja. And in terms of resistance management, using things like Lockstar will enable us to get on top of resistance development with plants like Buddleja, particularly when we're looking at infrastructure management. To summarise what I've been saying with respect to the management, it's critical that we use the right herbicides and surfactants to prevent flowering and establishment of mature Buddleja and rhododendron plants. Use residual herbicides to create a soil barrier and to kill germinating seeds in the longer term and minimise your site time. And then in terms of your long-term treatment, spot treatments using synthetic auxins or glyphosate with surfactants is going to be your most sustainable approach to treatment. But in certain cases, physical removal might be appropriate once we've broken the canopy of mature Buddleja or rhododendron. In terms of using, and this is kind of key contention, certainly in terms of upland management areas and areas of nature conservation, by using these methods, we reduce the overall dose, the overall application of herbicide into the environment because we achieve our end goal instead of stretching it out for decades using the wrong herbicides at the wrong time. And we also increase the amount of CO2 emitted by using ineffective methods. So things like using excavators to dig out rhododendron when herbicides would be absolutely suited to the job at hand. Ultimately, doing more with less, using the right stuff at the right time, we get better results. This runs through all of invasives management. Just going hard on invasive plants doesn't necessarily get you the results that you want. And just thinking about what we do, using the right treatments at the right time, we can get better results at the landscape scale. I'm going to finish up this lecture or webinar series with a bit of a discussion about ecology. And I think this is where I started with the invasive plants, and I think it's something worth considering going forward. So invasives get here mostly because we introduce them deliberately, and whether that be through agriculture, forestry, horticulture, or fisheries. And really, you know, we've spent a lot of time thinking about how best to manage these organisms once they become a problem. But really thinking about how we mitigate or prevent the spread of these plants is probably going to be a more sustainable, economically viable way of thinking about things going forwards. And if we can avoid situations like these, so at left you can see where Japanese knotweed stems have been used as a planting well, as an ornamental thing for people to put in houses. Where these stems go is quite unclear. You know, potentially spreading the Japanese knotweed. Right, you can see an instance in Texas where they're restocking lakes for game fishing, using invasive species which they claim will die off over the winter months when there's perfectly adequate local species that can be used for the same job. And then moving on to the species that we were directly talking about today, Buddleja is still widely planted, not only Buddleja davidi, but a range of different cultivars of that. And again, you know, Rhododendron is still promoted as being a popular horticultural species. New cultivars have been developed, and these are escaping into the environment. So you've got this continuous pressure of introduced species into the environment, and we're really playing catch up with these introductions. You know, there's a continuous rate of introduction, often with not too much thought about it, and then we're using these costly control processes to basically fix the problems that we've caused. And I think if possible, you know, moving beyond what we talk about in terms of control and management, it's certainly something that we need to consider in the future. So in summary, what I've been talking about today: use the right tools for the job, minimise the use of physical methods and herbicides over the treatment life cycle, do more with less. In the first instance, you really want to manage the mature plants as effectively as possible, and that normally means that you're going to be using foliar herbicide application. Critically, kill the mature plants before they set seed. That is absolutely fundamental to management of these plants. Again, fundamental to management these plants with foliar glyphosate application, use a surfactant. So we're talking about things like speedway and potentially water conditioners in areas of the UK with hard water. Target the seed bank, use residual herbicides to minimise your labour costs and increase the economic sustainability of your treatment programme. And target the seedlings as early as possible. As they grow and develop, you need to use more herbicide to effect kill of those before they mature, and again, over time begin to set seed and create more problems. And I think, you know, I highlighted this with the balsam and hogweed presentation, demonstrating excellent results where we have good sustainable management processes that demonstrate good practice. People are going to get more involved in that, and wherever possible, you know, working across the fence to develop local regional control strategies to do more with less. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dan. Once again, brilliant, well presented, really, really informative. I love sitting through these personally. Again, you've generated quite a lot of questions. I'm conscious of time, so we'll try and get through as many as possible. And then, like I said at the beginning, any we don't get through, we will cover between you and I offline, and we'll video it and share with everyone else to follow up. So a couple of questions that came in. So the first one, what are the advantages of using synthetic auxin herbicides for wood invasive weed control?
Particularly with woody invasive species, and this is what we're currently testing. We can use lower doses to get better kill of mature plants, and there's a bit of a tension really, particularly with rhododendron management, because FSC, I'm not a forester, but as I understand it, FSC mandates only the use of glyphosate for controlling weeds in forestry settings, and glyphosate needs to be used at quite high doses, and/or you need to use eco plugs in order to manage the rhododendron. Now, synthetic auxins, potentially we can use those using foliar application and at lower doses to effect complete kill of mature plants in a shorter amount of time. So there's a number of different issues around using synthetic auxins in forestry settings, but we're hoping that by developing an evidence base, we can expand their use in those kind of settings, and certainly for the use of for Buddleja management, thinking about using synthetic alternate selectives to manage those in linear estate, so roadsides, railway settings. This would seem to be a useful application of those actives.
Okay, another question. Richard Parkinson, like knotweed, are companies looking at insurance-backed guarantees for these woody plants?
The Property Care Association would be better placed to answer this. I think there is a general change in perception within the industry that Buddleja needs to be addressed in some shape or form. Rhododendron, not so much. It doesn't really impact on property. And coming back to kind of what we discussed with Parliament last year as well, there is an issue with Buddleja, and there's an impact on property, but it's a little bit different from knotweed, because we can kill the Buddleja plant outright, even if it means just doing it out by hand. What we were talking about in the presentation was like management over large scales, how to do that most efficiently. But if it came to it, you could dig the Buddleja plant out, and it would die if you just left it on hard standing. The knotweed creates the issue that even if it's controlled and managed below ground, it's still live. So you're passing on that problem to the next property owner. But in terms of direct impact on the built environment, there does need to be a greater awareness of the impact of Buddleja. And I think there's, because of its not being part of the Wildlife and Countryside Act, Schedule 9 species, I think its direct impacts on the environment and ecology are being overlooked. So that was a bit of an indirect answer, but that would seem to be where there does seem to be a better or more an increasing awareness around Buddleja and its effects on the environment. They are slightly different from knotweed, but there does need to be greater account taken of those negative impacts.
Okay, let's have a look here. There's a few questions all coming in, so the screen keeps scrolling, unfortunately. Right, a question from Joe Mullet. Sorry, he sent it a couple of times, so I think he had problems with his keyboard. I believe wounding the stems to get more effective glyphosate spray treatment was trialled by Plant Life on the Great Orme for cotton Easter. I think they found that just spraying better, especially with species such as cotton Easter horizontalis with flat surface to spray. I've used this method on Esgawa and found it very effective.
I would argue it's difficult to take anecdotal case studies as kind of, because it wasn't compared with a synthetic auxin, without surfactants, or with, you need to be testing these, and this is the kind of key kind of issue with the knotweed studies, is you've got to have direct comparisons between treatments and done at the same time in order that you can draw meaningful conclusions. I've no doubt that that might have been effective. I mean, ultimately, this is the problem. We need to have scale appropriate management data. So data that lasts for more than a few years. We need to have multiple treatments tested at the same time in order that we can say, look, that's the best treatment. I have no doubt that that treatment worked. Could it have worked quicker? Are there application methods that have been faster? This is where this kind of science comes into it. And you know, moving away from that anecdotal approach is really important, I think. And certainly, Cotoneaster is a much smaller species. We're talking about quite large plants with rhododendron, and to an extent with the Buddleja as well, what's left in situ. And the leaf form and structure is different, and they're much smaller leaves with Cotoneaster. I'd argue still that synthetic auxins should be used for the management of woody invasive plants. And coming back to the issue of dose, I would imagine that the application rate for managing with any method, application method, Cotoneaster would be quite a high dose. We'll probably be looking at around 10 litres per hectare. We could reduce that significantly using synthetic auxins and retain a grass sward. So it's quite difficult to kind of produce management recommendations on single case studies. But that doesn't, I'll be more than happy to look at control and management of Cotoneaster going forward.
Okay, well, we can always look at that offline. That's absolutely fine. Question from Mark Dazelle. Would these methods also work for established ivy, which also has waxy leaf surface?
Well, this is an anecdotal case study because I've got a lot of it in my garden. And at the Buddleja site, I've found good results with glyphosate. I can't remember which formulation it was. I've been using a lot of herbicides recently. Glyphosate with, I think it was top film, but I used a surfactant with that. I think anything with a waxy leaf, we need to be thinking about surfactants. I think that this overlooked component of invasive plant management, and I'm talking about knotweed again, but when you think that your knotweed application window is really narrow, it's at a wet time of the year, and when you think about rhododendron, it's in upland areas of better sequoia, that site, the site that I highlighted in the presentation, it's close to one of the wettest areas in the UK, and the UK is wet as a whole. If you've got a limited application window, you've got limited site time, you should be using adjuvant surfactants to make sure that that herbicide is retained on the leaf surface. I mean, as a component of your overall management strategy, it's so small, but could be crucial in making sure that each year you're keeping on top of that problem.
Okay. Richard Parkinson again. Dan mentioned treating in the growing season, but is there a peak month and plant size that will deliver the best results? Also, do you notice more of an impact in urban areas and brownfield sites with Buddleja than you do in the wild?
Well, so we've got two questions there. In terms of the impact of Buddleja, it's apparently, I've not seen this, but it's impacting on calcareous grasslands now. It's spreading into those areas in the southeast. So it's starting to have a direct impact in areas of nature conservation. There's a number of quarries that have got nature designations for other reasons that are becoming overgrown with Buddleja, certainly in up towards the Peak District there that I'm aware of. I've not visited them. So you've got that impact of Buddleja in the environment is expanding. So you've got initial invasion through routes of communication, and then it's spreading out from those introduction areas. So it's quite similar in a sense to Himalayan balsam, where you've had rapid spread throughout river systems and damp ground, and then that is spreading out now into other habitats where it's still quite competitive. So you can have kind of a secondary wave of invasion now going out from, with respect to Buddleja, going out from those initial areas of introduction into the wider environment. In terms of the treatment timing with both of those species, it's slightly, from what I've read and understood, it's a longer window of application that you can achieve throughout the growing season, but I'm being careful about what I say now. There might be, depending on what our experiments say, times of the year when application would be most effective. But certainly my recommendation would be to use synthetic autogens that are better suited for the management of woody invasives over glyphosate where possible.
Okay, unfortunately, we are out of time. There are still questions that have come in. So Dan, we will take this up and record this and reshare later on. On behalf of ICL and Dan at Advanced Invasives, thank you everyone that's taken the time to register for all of these events and attend them. They've been really well attended. The questions have been fantastic as well. Dan, on behalf of myself and ICL, thank you. It's always enjoyable listening to you talk, and personally, I learn a lot every single time we go on. So I think that brings us to a close. Thank you once again. Because these have been so well received, we are discussing the possibility of doing more of these webinars. Timings and subjects are still very much being decided on at the minute. As things develop, we will make sure we keep you all aware, and we'd like to see you back and hopefully join us again. Once again, Dan, everyone, thank you very much, and keep safe, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you all.
Cheers.